مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس على نورس بريس. يسير قطار التطبيع السوري التركي بتسارع دون أن يلتفت لنداءات وبكائيات المعارضة السورية التي عولت كل التعويل على تركيا التي تغير اليوم من استراتيجياتها بالكامل تجاه سوريا. فهل الحديث عن تطبيع سوري تركي مرهون ومرتبط بالانتخابات التركية أم أنه سيحدث بالفعل تغيير في موازين القوى على أرض الواقع؟ وكيف تتعامل واشنطن مع هذه الخطوة التي ينتقدها كبار المسؤولين والمحللين السياسيين في العاصمة الأمريكية؟ هذا ما نبحثه في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين، وضيوفي لهذه الحلقة هما مدينة مينيابوليس الأمريكية. ينضم إلينا الباحث والمحلل السياسي المختص في الصراعات الدولية السيد ترينتون شوينبرغ. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة هذه الحلقة. سيد ترينتون، الانتقادات الأمريكية لخطوات التطبيع التركي السوري كثيرة. سمعنا من عدد من المسؤولين الأمريكيين السابقين انتقادات لاذعة لتحرك تركيا باتجاه التطبيع مع دمشق. حضرتك كنت أيضا من المنتقدين لهذه الخطوة، كتبت عدة مقالات بهذا الصدد. ولكن هل من خطوات عملية ممكن أن نراها من قبل إدارة الرئيس جو بايدن تقطع الطريق على تركيا وتوقف قطار التطبيع مع دمشق؟
So I think that this is a question that deserves a very brief revisiting of specifically the Turkish relationship with Damascus and the American relationship with Damascus, both of which historically, at least in the past decade, have been fairly unanimously hostile towards Damascus. Now, neither side took overt military action towards the Syrian regime until 2017, when the United States launched airstrikes on the uh, T4 airbase in Tadmur, and 2020, when the Turkish military grew militarily involved in the Syrian conflict. But behind the scenes, there is certainly a bit of a different vibe that you might get from the press releases, from the official statements. When it comes to the United States, there's always been this sense of outward unwillingness to normalize, outward uh, lack of desire for any kind of communication other than what's necessary behind closed doors. But you also get this sense that there are a number of officials within the State Department who are looking at regional developments. What are our partners doing in the region? What is Turkey doing? What is Qatar doing? What are the Emirates doing? What is Saudi Arabia doing? And with all that in mind, and with all of their changes in policy taken into account, you might see some interest in following them when they've made their own decisions. And now, that doesn't mean that the United States is necessarily taking a step back or that they're letting regional partners do as they please, but it may be reflective of a change in policy of allowing our regional allies to make their priorities known and heard and perhaps be more supportive of them than we have in the past. So when it comes to Biden's actual policy, I think that normalization as a whole is off the table, but there's some wiggle room that's being offered to our partners in the region to coordinate with Damascus, create new outreach attempts, and maybe get something back in return. What that might be, it's kind of up in the air.
تركيا تقول أنها منفتحة على رؤية الجيش السوري ينتشر على كامل الحدود السورية التركية في الشمال السوري، ولكن نعرف هناك جيش أمريكي اليوم في الشمال السوري، هناك قوات سوريا الديمقراطية، هناك حملة لمكافحة تنظيم داعش. ما هي خيارات إدارة الرئيس جو بايدن غير البيانات، غير ما نسمعه من بيانات تندد بما تفعله تركيا؟
So there are always backdoor options, and I keep that kind of vague because it varies from country to country. Syria has a very complex and honestly kind of nebulous internal system of governance. Ultimately, it's built around a very high risk, high reward patronage and client structure that focuses on benefits to the central core of the regime, that being the Assad family and their closest backers and benefactors, and a ring of clients who are seeking favor, seeking to obtain power within the regime, seeking to stay in favor. And with that kind of system, there comes a certain level of unpredictability, with who you're dealing with, but that also creates interesting opportunities to engage in backdoor negotiations when you may be presented with a faction within the government that is interested in negotiation or being a middleman. So there is not a very clear picture of what kind of opportunities we have for quote unquote diplomacy before you get to normalization. But one of the big sticking points that the Biden administration has brought up multiple times is the continued missing status of Austin Tice, who was kidnapped in 2013. A pretty familiar story for those who have followed American diplomacy with Syria previously. There have been, to my knowledge, three separate statements that the Biden administration has put out with regards to Tice. Um, whether or not he's still alive, it's kind of anyone's guess based on what the State Department has said. They seem to be convinced that he's still alive, but his existence has been used as a doorway for the administration to open some level of negotiation with the regime. I wouldn't call that normalization, but I think there is some kind of semi-constant contact that is ongoing with somebody who is in the upper echelons of the regime, whether it's a military commander or whether it's a civil authority or a politician. That has not been announced, and that's also up to interpretation.
سيد ترينتون، هناك عدد كبير من الدراسات والإحصائيات والمقالات التي تؤكد بأن الجيش السوري لم يكن قادر على استعادة كافة الأراضي السورية دون مساعدة جماعات مسلحة مرتبطة بإيران، دون مساعدة روسيا، دون مساعدة عدة لاعبين خارجيين، وأن أعداد الجيش العربي السوري تدنت من أكثر من 100,000 جندي لبضعة عشرات من الآلاف من الجنود. كيف ممكن لهذا الجيش اليوم أن يغطي الشمال السوري؟ ألا تخشى واشنطن من أن يكون البديل عن الجيش السوري في حال يعني مضت الصفقة التركية السورية هو ميليشيات مرتبطة بإيران أو حتى روسيا؟
So the big concern is that some level of normalization is going to allow the Syrian army to redeploy forces away from Aleppo and Idlib because there will be no hostilities, at least between them and Turkish-backed rebels. It's a different story for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who does not recognize any level of normalization, and they've very publicly stated their opposition to normalization between Ankara and Damascus. And I don't think that will change at all. That's something that's going to be very concrete, at least in the near future. But if there is some level of agreement between Turkey and Syria with regards to northern Aleppo, that would effectively freeze the conflict that is in place between the Turkish-backed rebel groups and the Syrian army. And when that happens, not only is there redeployment, but there is almost certainly going to be a return of Iranian assets to that region, expansion of Iranian assets elsewhere. It's pressure being taken off of both Damascus and Tehran, and they can sort of take a breather, figure out what their priorities are now, and potentially put their efforts elsewhere. And those efforts may be redirected farther east, where there has been, ever since 2017, with the removal of ISIS from Deir ez-Zor, there's been an Iranian presence there that has only grown and rooted itself in the region. And this has always been a concern for not only the YPG and the SDF, but also U.S. interests in the region, particularly because there have been multiple examples of open hostilities between U.S. and Iranian forces. Now, the most notable of those was the Battle of Khashab back in 2017. And since then, there haven't been any engagements to that scale, but there have been exchanges of rocket and artillery fire. There have been attempts to strike U.S. bases in Deir ez-Zor on the northern side of the river. And the concern would be that if there is a redeployment of Iranian forces, they have more assets in that region with which they can strike at U.S. positions and by extension SDF positions. And ultimately, there's calculus involved there about what level of risk there may be, not only to equipment and personnel, but also to the broader strategy against ISIS. Well, I will admit that whoever's job it is to discuss these issues at an official level, I don't envy them. It's certainly a bit of a tightrope that they're walking on. The Turkish stance towards the SDF is clearly not going to change anytime soon. They have maintained that their policy towards the SDF, and by extension, the YPG and the PKK, will be one of hostility, listing them as a terror group, treating them as a non-state entity. And while the United States has arguably fluctuated in their level of support to the SDF and the YPG, our on the ground presence has not changed dramatically. And with that, there has been no dramatic change in our level of equipment or military support to the SDF. So that raises the question of, is this going to be, when this solution comes up, and eventually this will come to a head, somebody will act, there will be a change. Is it going to be a political one? So are we going to see some level of integration of the YPG and the SDF into the Syrian government military structure? Are we going to see autonomy being provided to this region by Damascus willingly? Are we going to see some level of military action, either by the SAA, the TSK, or both? It's up in the air, and my own personal thoughts on this are that eventually there is going to be some sort of settlement where Damascus is going to have to accept reality that they don't have the means to militarily conquer that territory. They don't have the means to disarm the YPG or the SDF on their own. Certainly, if this were 2011 and the rebellion had been suppressed, that might be a different story. But 10 years of war have happened. 10 years of war have exhausted the Syrian army. And there's no way that I see them being able to effectively disarm the YPG and the SDF and retake that territory. So while their rhetoric may remain hostile and aggressive, and they always talk about how the YPG is a partner force for imperialist occupation of Syrian territory, there is, to me, just no conceivable way that they can enforce that rhetoric and really make a difference. So there will be some sort of political situation. Now, that I assume, and I think based on the recent talks that Damascus and Ankara have had, there will be some sort of process that involves isolating the YPG and the SDF and the Autonomous Administration as much as possible to keep pressure on them and potentially spur a collapse. But that, to me, is more of a political route, and that takes significantly longer. That may be a process that takes years.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي ترينتون شوينبورن، كنت معنا من مينيابوليس.
Yeah.
وختاما شكرا لكل متابعي واشنطن أونلاين ونورث بريس. ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل. إلى اللقاء.